you to our 4th session in our monthly Lunch and Learn series. Again, Revolution Group will be discussing topics of interest for best practices for your small to medium business on a monthly basis. If there's a topic you're interested in discussing, please feel free to tweet at rev_group using the hashtag Lunch and Learn, and we would take that topic into consideration for future webinars. As many of you may know, we are a premier IT consultant serving small to medium businesses in the greater Columbus area for over 20 years now. Today's discussion will be centered on disaster and backup recovery. Again, I am joined today by our IT architect, Scott Coffman, who will dive deeper into the subject throughout the presentation. If there are any questions throughout, please feel free to type them in the browser, and we will address them at the conclusion of the presentation. And I will now turn the controls over to Scott Coffman.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be talking to you on backup and disaster recovery. This is definitely a source of ambiguity for a lot of the clients I talk to. I'd like to kind of go through the questions that I ask clients when starting to discuss backup and disaster recovery solutions, and just to make people aware of what goes into planning a backup and disaster recovery solution. To start with, I'd like to kind of get into the differences between backup and disaster recovery. You can think of backups as really just a file and folder based backup solution. So backup's definition is really retention-based data storage used for file and folder restoration. So Susie from accounting deleted a file, you need to restore it from last week or from yesterday, or perhaps you have a corrupt SQL database and you need to restore that database. That can be thought of as just traditional backup as well. Backup, though, is really a subset of disaster recovery, which is the process to recover resources or applications and data to a usable state after a site or platform failure. So while backup is the restoration of an individual file or folder, disaster recovery really is the restoration of a server or an application or a clustered application. It involves more than just the act of restoring the service, but also the planning for the restoring of the service, making sure you have those resources that you're going to restore to available. One thing to always keep in mind, Stephen Covey states it best in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is to begin with the end in mind. I believe the same goes for data backup and disaster recovery. You have to back up your data as if you'll one day need to get it back. If you only think about performing backups and disaster recovery from the standpoint of the IT personnel performing the backup and disaster recovery, you may not always have the restoration best practices in mind. Example would be, trying to, maybe you're using a tape-based solution and you're performing those backups to tapes striped across multiple tapes, which helps improve the speed of the backup. But when it comes time to actually restore from those backups, are you going to be able to make sure you know which tapes are in which set, and you know how to identify them and get them to a place where they can restore faster? So it's always good to kind of think about not just how fast can I back this up and how am I going to back this up, but think about how am I going to need to restore this, and really let that drive kind of the way you start defining how you want to do your backup and disaster recovery. A good analogy to help illustrate the difference between backup and disaster recovery would be to imagine that your car is the server, your car is the application, and your data is the wheels or the tires. And let's assume you're driving down the road and you have a flat tire or you lose data. You can always pull that spare tire out of the trunk and get going again. You can restore from backup and get going again. Let's say you got in a crash and your car is no longer functioning. This is more of a disaster recovery. How do you replace your car? Not just the tires in the car, but how do you replace the entire car? Do you have another car sitting standby, or do you need to rent a car? Do you have an agreement with someone else to borrow their car? These are all the kind of the things that you have to think about in a disaster recovery plan. Now that we've kind of discussed backup and DR, I want to discuss what backup and DR is not, which is business continuity. That's a separate topic. DR is definitely a subset of a business continuity plan, but a business continuity plan is more business-centric as opposed to IT or data-centric. It really boils down to how you can continue your business in the event of a disaster. You know, what do you need recovered first to stay in business? You know, what do your customers need assured of to ensure that you're going to be up and running soon? What do your business partners require to continue order fulfillment and delivery? Maybe you have agreements with vendors that you need to comply to. Maybe you have to think about where people are going to go and work. What computers are they going to use? How will they be notified where to go? Those are all things that are part of the entire business continuity plan, which is more about resuming business operations, of which DR is a subset of that. DR is the facilitator of the information services. The business continuity is more the business process and the soft things related to employees. A couple of examples of backup and DR scenarios just to kind of drive home the difference of the two. You know, backup and restore scenarios, like as I mentioned, someone deleting a file or a folder. You know, impact from virus, we've seen an uptick in crypto infections where, you know, a computer gets infected and it goes out and encrypts all the data on the server map drives. The only way to recover from that is to restore from backup. So another example would be if you have industry compliance regulations, you need to maintain a 7-year retention of data or something like that. Backups can help you accomplish that with some low-cost archival retention. And, of course, data corruption or server corruption, which could lead into more of a DR scenario. From the DR standpoint, a few different broad areas where you may encounter a scenario where you need to recover from a disaster: system failure, power, communications, or hardware. Maybe it's a specific server that fails. Environmental, just what you think: tornado, hurricane, snowstorm, a flood, fire. Maybe deliberate acts of terrorism, sabotage, theft, arson. Believe it or not, I've seen it. Other emergency situations, you know, maybe a legal situation where you have to, you don't have access to a certain subset of your information for a legal reason. When you talk about backups and disaster recovery and trying to define how you are going to implement your strategy, you really need to look at the RPO and RTO. These are the two questions whenever, you know, a customer asks me, well, what do I need to do for backups? And I'll ask them, well, you know, what do you need for a RPO, which is a recovery point objective? The definition is the maximum tolerable period in which data might be lost due to a major incident. In reality, what that means is how many backups do you have? How far back do they go? How often are you doing your backups? Those are recovery point. When you are doing your backups every night and you're keeping them for 7 days, you have 7 recovery points. On the other side is the recovery time objective. That is the duration of time within which a business process must be restored after a disaster or disruption in order to avoid unacceptable consequences to the organization. Essentially what that means is, how long will it take you to recover? You know, how long will it take you to source that new car and get back on the road again? So if we look at kind of a timeline below there, you can see, you know, in this example, 10 a.m. disaster declaration. Let's say 7 a.m. is your latest recovery point, and it's going to take you 3 hours, which would be your recovery time objective. So your RPO is 3 hours, and your RTO is 3 hours, which equals a total of 6 hours of lost service. So there's the 3 hours it takes to recover, and then you have 3 hours of 3-hour-old stale data. And on top of that, you may need to take an additional hours to manually re-enter that data that you missed in those 3 hours old recovery point. Kind of showing this in action and kind of some financial examples of how RPOs and RTOs matter is to take a look at some scenarios. In this example, it shows a disaster that occurs at 4 p.m. on a Monday. The last RPO available is 16 hours old. So those backups occurred at midnight on Monday. And in this example, we're showing a 4-hour recovery time. So a 16-hour RPO and a 4-hour RTO is 20 hours. And assuming it's going to take 16 hours of data recreation for that lost time during the RPO, that's a total loss of 36 hours. And just some example math, taking in a business that has $300 million in annual revenue and assuming a 24/7 operations, this comes out to a little over $34,000 an hour. Or in this example, over 36 hours, the downtime cost the business approximately $1.2 million. Obviously, this is just a generic example. You'd have to apply this to your own business to figure out what the financial impact of that RTO and RPO is. But just kind of show you, shortening that RPO and RTO time frame, the impact it has in the disaster as far as the financial implications go. In this next example, we're changing the 16-hour RPO and the 4-hour RTO to a 6-hour RPO and a 2-hour RTO. In this example, the total loss is 14 hours as opposed to 36 hours. And as you can see, the cost of downtime went from $1.2 million to just under $500,000. So obviously, in this example, having that shorter RPO and RTO saved the company a lot of money. But as you can imagine, it costs more money to have shorter RPO and RTO windows. The shorter that those windows get, generally, the more expensive it is to implement. So who defines the RPO and the RTO? In a lot of cases, it falls on the shoulders of the IT department or the IT consultant. But really, when I talk with customers, I tell them that why would you want someone that's not a part of your business defining what the business goals are in the event of a disaster? DR should not be an IT-driven initiative. IT is the facilitator of DR, but the business leaders really need to be the ones that define the scope as it pertains to the risk tolerance of the business. Think of it as an insurance policy. How much is the business willing to risk to not buy that insurance policy, which is backup and disaster recovery? Representatives from all departments and business functions need to be involved. There may be an operations team that uses a specific application, and they need to have their input on what their RPO and RTO objectives are. Maybe they can't afford to lose 30 minutes of data. Maybe they need to have an RPO of 15 minutes. They need to be the ones that define what that is, and then obviously that goes into figuring out a budget and time frame, and IT can help with that and say, oh, if you want this type of RPO and this RTO, you're going to be in this kind of cost tier, whereas maybe if you're a little bit more flexible, you can go to a different cost tier that's lower costing. It's really important to make sure that the business has buy-in and input on why the RPO and RTO should not be defined by IT. You wouldn't want your mechanic telling you what car you should buy. You really need to figure that out for yourself and what your needs are. Kind of taking into account the RPO and RTO, I wanted to go through kind of some generic backup and disaster recovery options. I don't want to get too specific to a technology or a vendor. I get asked a lot from our client relationship consultants, our account managers that go and meet with customers and discuss, technology needs for the business. Scott, do you have like a canned, 3 different backup options I can present to these customers? And I tell them it's not that easy. While we have a few preferred solutions, I never make that the only solutions, because the vendor or the business really needs to define what their needs are. And if it doesn't fit one of those solutions, then obviously we need to look elsewhere. It really is very dependent upon the business needs and their current infrastructure types. Do you have a heady virtualization solution? Are you all virtual? Or do you have a mix of physical servers and virtual servers? Do you have multiple locations? Do you have another location available to be a hot site? Are you in a co-located facility? Maybe you're in the cloud. All of these things need to be thought of when you're designing a solution, along with your RPO and your RTO requirements. So kind of putting all those things together help kind of put together the pros and cons of solutions as it pertains to that business. And Revolution Group does that with all of our customers today. And we've seen a lot of different examples of backup software, what works, what doesn't work. We've been through restoration and disaster recovery procedures. We know how long these things take. With that in mind, kind of going through kind of the different tiers, if we go kind of the lowest tier of backup and disaster recovery is kind of your traditional tape or disk-based local backups. Nowadays, there's also kind of offsite cloud backup solutions. Tape or disk-based, usually those are run as nightly differential jobs or incrementals and weekly fulls. So your RPO is daily, 24 hours. The recovery time on those really depends upon the environment. Do you have if it's just a site or a server failure, do you have a environment that allows, a virtual environment that allows the restoration of a backup to a virtual machine and run it from there? Or are you a physical server and your physical server is no longer there? Now you need to source new hardware. So really the RTO of a tape or disk-based backup solution could really range from hours to weeks. In some cases we've seen in very bad examples of clients using their application server as their backup server, which housed their tape drives. So they're backing up the tapes on the server that houses their application, and that server crashed. We had to rebuild the server, rebuild the backup solution, re-inventory all the tapes, and then we could restore the data. This process took almost a week due to tape read times. So having to kind of going back to having that end in mind, not just how am I going to back up this data, but how am I going to restore this data, and making sure you're thinking that through and not setting yourself up for failure in the event of an actual restoration event. Kind of the next tier of that for small and medium-sized business is using a backup and disaster recovery appliance, or BDR as it's known in the industry. What these devices are servers themselves. They could be a vendor appliance, or it could be kind of you buy your own server and you install your software. Some examples of these would be Shadow Protect, Aperture, Datto, and possibly even a Unitrends or a Barracuda appliance. What these servers do is they back up the servers in your environment to the appliance itself and then replicate that data off-site. So you have local backups, and it's also off-site to protect against a site failure. But some other additional features that most of these solutions have is the appliance is capable of hosting those backups as a virtual machine on top of itself. So if you have a server failure, you can restore that backup to itself and really cut down the amount of time for restoration, and allows you time to source new hardware and then move that restored server back onto physical hardware if that's the case. And also, a lot of times, these BDR vendors include cloud hosting capabilities. So, for example, our Revon Backup Plus solution, which uses Datto appliances, you get 30 days a year of off-site cloud hosting. So those backups that you're replicating to the cloud, they can take those, restore them as a virtual machine in their cloud, and that at least gives you some access to your servers while you're dealing with the local disaster. The RPO and RTO windows for these, usually the RPOs can be defined down to 15 or 30-minute increments. Usually we run these hourly. The RTO, the recovery time on these, can be measured in minutes or hours. A lot of times you can have ready-to-go hot copies of those VMs running on the appliance, and you can just make them live. Other cases you actually need to restore, so obviously however large the server is, it'll define how long that time is, but that's usually hours as opposed to days or weeks. And again, kind of the high tier of disaster recovery is really kind of different. It's not backup and disaster recovery, it's really just disaster recovery, so you would pair this with another, maybe a tape or disk-based solution, which is having a synchronized copy of your servers and your data in another location, whether it be maybe it's another facility you manage, maybe it's a data center, maybe it's the cloud. Anyway, you have a replicated copy of those servers in another location. This is usually achieved through virtualization, and VMware has Site Recovery Manager. Hyper-V, Microsoft's Hyper-V solution has some Azure cloud options to build into that. And there's also the ability to automate these plans, so you can have one button and it does all the work for you, and all you got to do is get clients connected to where the new servers are. Obviously, as you can imagine, this requires an extensive hardware and software investment. This is usually used to provide RPOs that are sub-hourly, and having the RTOs be attained in minutes as opposed to hours or weeks, as the data is already there, it's synchronized, maybe it's 30 minutes behind, maybe it's an hour behind, but being able to flip that switch and go to the other environment. So those are kind of the 3 different tiers. At this time, open it up to any questions that we have and turn it back over to Scott Ratterman. Appreciate everybody joining today and taking the time to listen to me spiel about backups and disaster recovery.
All right, thank you, Scott. We did have a couple questions come in. The first question is asking about if I were to move my servers to the cloud, what does that specifically mean to backup and disaster recovery?
Sure. So, moving to the cloud is, well, you still have to do backups and disaster recovery. Just because it's someone else's problem doesn't mean you don't have to think about it. It's just because you don't have to worry about having a fire at your office and losing your server anymore doesn't mean you don't need to still plan for other scenarios. So in many cases, the cloud providers offer integrated backup mechanisms. I know Amazon, their EC2 cloud instances, they have an API that's open up to a lot of different vendors that can do backups. But a lot of other managed cloud environments have built-in backup mechanisms that can then be transferred off-site and possibly even go to another geographic location of their data center that can then be restored. So obviously, if you're going to the cloud, you have to take considerations into ensuring you're protecting yourself. You still have to do backups. Just because it's not your problem necessarily anymore, you still have to plan for it. So again, I would say if you want some more specific answers to that question, I'd say talk to your account manager, and maybe we can set up a time to discuss your need in detail.
All right. The other question we had come in was how many copies of backups is recommended?
In general, kind of the industry standard is 3, 2 of which being different media. So a good example would this be to have a local disk copy of it. Maybe you're doing backup to disk, so you have your disk copy of backups, and then maybe you then copy those backups to tape, and those tapes are then taken off-site. So really you want 3 copies of your data, 2 of which need to be maybe local and on different media, or 2 which need to be on different media, so disk and tape. So for example, you could have multiple recovery points on your local disk and then having a separate copy of that data on a tape mechanism or maybe an external hard drive or replicated to a cloud environment. But 3 is the industry best standard.
Okay. All right. It looks like that's all we have in terms of questions. Again, if there are any questions, Scott's contact information is listed below, or is listed on the slide. And again, if there's any future topics you might be interested in having us cover, please feel free to, using the hashtag #LunchAndLearn, send us a message on Twitter, and we will go from there. Again, if there's any questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you.